going to read to you from the Black Jacobins, and we're near the end of the book. We're in the War of Independence, and Leclerc has, I just read you a big quote of letters from Leclerc whining and complaining to Napoleon about how badly things are going and Napoleon's efforts to restore slavery in San Domingo, what we now know as Haiti and the Dominican Republic. So, here we go. On the night of October 11th, at a reception given by Pauline Leclerc, Clairvaux, the mulatto, said openly for everyone to hear, quote, I have always been free. Only new circumstances have enabled me to elevate my reviled color. But if I fancied that the restoration of slavery would ever be thought of, that instant I would become a brigand, end quote. The mulattoes were, for the most part, hostile to the return of slavery, but despite his threats, Clairvaux still hesitated. It was Pétion who acted and forced his hand. Pétion was holding positions near Le Cap with mulatto troops. All these men were only waiting on their leaders. At Pétion's command, they spiked the guns, disarmed the Europeans, and with a singular humanity, which they would soon regret, allowed these to go back to Le Cap. Pétion then went to Clairvaux, told him that the colonial troops were in revolt, and that if he did not wish to pay with his head for these defections, the only thing to do was to join. Then only did Clairvaux join. Together, Pétion and Clairvaux had 3,000 colored soldiers devoted to them. Leclerc had but 300 white soldiers in Le Cap and had no suspicions of mulatto defection. But for the vacillation of Clairvaux, a sudden movement would have put Le Cap and Leclerc himself into their hands entirely. As it was, the French had time to take the alarm, summon reinforcements, and put themselves in a state of defense. Thus, when Pétion and Clairvaux did make the attack, they were checked, but all white Le Cap was badly frightened. Leclerc sent over 1,000 blacks on board ships in the harbor to get them out of the way. And when the battle began, he felt himself in danger. He ordered that they should be drowned. The sailors massacred them and threw them overboard. Dessalines in the west was waiting. He had been preparing for weeks now, not giving in the arms that he was taking as he had done at first. As soon as he learned that Pétion and Clairvaux had started, he left Gonaives and set out for Petit Rivière, giving the word to his supporters to be ready to pray and to raise the laborers at a given signal. The priest of Petit Rivière invited him to breakfast, and he went, not knowing that word had already come for his arrest and that he would be taken by the presbytery. Madame Payot, the curé's servant, a mulatto, laid the table and then brought Dessalines a bowl of water in which to wash his hands. Looking hard into his eyes, she pressed her elbows to her sides and then moved them backward, a sign that he was going to be bound. Already, the soldiers were surrounding the house. Dessalines bolted for the door. The curé called to him. He replied that he had to perform some military duty. He sprang on his horse and, followed by his guard, he rode off towards Artibonite, firing 3 pistol shots in the air and crying out, to arms, to arms. It had been a near thing. Christophe still hesitated for a day or two, but on October 14th he joined Pétion and Clairvaux at last. The mulattoes in the south still stuck to the French, but in the north and west the masses now had trained soldiers and leaders. Leclerc, through illness or bitterness, never wrote this news to his brother-in-law, or to the minister. He sent to beg Christophe to come back, promising him honors and riches. Christophe replied that he was rich and honored enough in possessing liberty himself, and in securing the liberty of his color. On the night of November On the night of November 2nd, Leclerc died. But before he died, he knew that he had failed, and that San Domingo was lost to France. Of 34,000 French soldiers who had landed, 24,000 were dead, 8,000 were in the hospital, and 2,000 exhausted men remained. Thousands of brave black soldiers were dead for no other crime than that of refusing to be slaves once more. The colony was devastated, and blacks and whites were murdering each other with a growing ferocity in what was called a race war, but whose origin was not in their different colors, but in the greed of the French bourgeoisie. Leclerc knew that whatever reinforcements were sent, all was over. Before he died, he confessed his grief over an enterprise undertaken on men and by men worthy of a better fate, on account of the services they had rendered and still would have been able to render to France. We owe him no thanks for the admission. It did not in any way mitigate the blood that would yet be shed and the suffering still to be borne before the people of San Domingo, freed themselves from this abomination of murder, greed, cruelty, sadism, inhumanity let loose upon them by Napoleon and his government in the name of a superior civilization. Quote, unfortunately, the condition of the colonies is not known in France. We have there a false idea of the Negro. We have in Europe a false idea of the country in which we fight and the men whom we fight against, end quote. There, the ex-slaves, those were quotes of Leclerc, by the way. Again, I think I had read them before, but the author chose to restate them to make a point. There, the ex-slaves of the San Domingo Revolution established their affinity with the population of revolutionary France. Between 1789 and Waterloo in 1815, Waterloo in 1815 is when Napoleon lost power and was overthrown. The people of France staggered Europe and the world with the colossal scope of their achievements in war and in peace. No one had previously conceived that so much power was hidden in a people. Hilaire Belloc has perhaps expressed it best when he said that after August 1792, the reactionary classes of Europe armed against this new monster and set themselves two tasks, to reach Paris and to destroy democracy. The first task, he continues, took them 22 years. On the second, they are still engaged. We see the same in San Domingo. The population had been transformed. No one could have guessed the power that was born in them when Buchmann gave the signal for revolt on that stormy August night in 1791. Rebellion, war, peace, economic organization, international diplomacy, administration, they had shown their capacity. Now the new nation was to undergo its final test. What happened in San Domingo after Leclerc's death is one of those pages in history which every schoolboy should learn, and most certainly will learn someday. The national struggle against Bonaparte in Spain, the burning of Moscow by the Russians that fills the histories of the period, were anticipated and excelled by the blacks and mulattoes on the island of San Domingo. The records are there. For self-sacrifice and heroism, men, women, and children who drove out the French stand second to no fighters for independence in any place or time. And the reason was simple. They had seen at last that without independence, they could not maintain their liberty, and liberty was far more concrete for former slaves than the elusive forms of political democracy in France. Rochambeau succeeded Leclerc, and he was confident of success. Although in the north and west, the French held only Le Cap and a few towns, Spanish San Domingo was absolutely quiet. The great body of mulattoes in the south, especially the rich proprietors, were still loyal. Rochambeau, setting out for Le Cap to take command, left the Black Laplume holding command in the south, and Laplume remained faithful to the end. The French were in a critical position, but Rochambeau asked for 15,000 troops at one stroke to destroy the, quote, brigands, end quote, then another 10,000, and finally another 10,000. Quote, these three dispatches are indispensable. A point not less essential for the success of our army is the total destruction or deportation of the black and mulatto generals, officers, and soldiers, end quote. How that black army worried them. Rochambeau asked to send that rascal Toussaint to the galleys. Quote, if he comes here, I shall hang him without trial. End quote. Before long, he received 10,000 men from Bonaparte. Also, the fever was abating, and convalescents began to return to their regiments. Rochambeau captured Fort Dauphin and Port-au-Pay, and grew even more confident. What seemed to have confused him was the policy of Dessalines and Pétion. Christophe and Clairvaux were attacking, but blacks and mulattoes had long recognized Dessalines as commander-in-chief, with Pétion as his unofficial second-in-command. Dessalines traveled over the island, reorganizing the local troops. Many of the petty chiefs and rank-and-file viewed him, as was natural, with distrust. He and Pétion won them over or hunted them down and destroyed them. Dessalines drilled the raw levies daily, preparing for a campaign on a grand scale. In the middle of January, Rochambeau asked for authorization to restore slavery at once. Leclerc had not even dared to confide Bonaparte's authorization to him. So utterly opposed were the sentiments of even post-revolutionary France to the reactionary savagery of the maritime bourgeois. While waiting for his authorization, Rochambeau began on his own account to exterminate the mulattoes. They outnumbered the whites, and looking forward to the restoration of white supremacy, he thought it as well to get rid of as many as possible. Rochambeau hated the mulattoes more than the blacks. One night at Port Republican, he gave a great ball to which he invited several of the mulatto women. It was a magnificent fete. At midnight, Rochambeau stops the dancing and begs them to enter the neighboring apartment. Okay, sorry, my alarm just went off. And begs them to enter into a neighboring apartment. This room, lit by a single lamp, is hung with black draperies in which white material figures as skulls. In the four corners are coffins. In the middle of their horrified silence, the mulatto women hear funeral chants sung by invisible singers. Dumb with terror, they stood rooted to the spot, while Rochambeau told them, you have assisted at the funeral ceremonies of your husbands and your brothers. The French shot and drowned them, hundreds at a time, and not only shot the rich, but confiscated their property. By early March, the mulatto South was in full insurrection, but the Spaniards in the West and Laplume still stuck to the French. Rochambeau received all 20,000 men after Leclerc's death, but by now, Dessalines was ready. We cannot describe that war in detail. It was a war not so much of armies as of the people. It was now a war with the racial divisions emphasizing the class struggle, blacks and mulattoes against whites. Leclerc had proposed a war of extermination, and Rochambeau waged it. As late as November 4th, Clairvaux, who had served a long time under Toussaint, was confident that the French could still count on the, quote, free Negroes and proprietors as much as on the whites, end quote. But he counted without Rochambeau's precipitancy. Precipitancy means like extreme action. 1 week later, his tone had changed. Quote, this is no longer a war. It is a fight of tigers. One has to be in a transport of frenzy to keep it up. And I have to keep on telling the troops, It is no longer bravery. It is no longer bravery I want from you. It is rage. But one cannot always be enraged, and humanity makes us weep sometimes." End quote. But he wept, but he fought. Rochambeau drowned so many people in the Bay of Le Cap that for many a long day, the people of the district would not eat fish. Following the example, the Spaniards in Cuba and the English in Jamaica, he brought 1,500 dogs to hunt down the blacks. The day he arrived there, the day they arrived, there was a fete. That means a party. In the grounds of a former Jesuit convent, an amphitheater was constructed, and on a certain day, a young black was led in and bound to a post, while the whites of Le Cap, the women in brilliant costumes, sat waiting. And Toussaint had shot Moise and the blacks of Limbe, Dondon, and Plaisance for their hostility to these very people. To the sound of martial music arrived Rochambeau, surrounded by his staff. But when the dogs were let loose, they did not attack the victim. Boyer, chief of staff, in place of the dead Dondon, jumped into the arena and with a stroke of his sword, cut open the belly of a black. At the sight and scent of the blood, the dogs threw themselves on the black and devoured him in a twinkling, while the applause ran round the arena and the band played. To encourage them in a liking for blood, blacks were daily delivered to them, until the dogs, though useless in battle, would throw themselves on blacks at sight. The French burned alive, hanged, drowned, tortured, and started again their old habit of burying blacks up to their necks near nests of insects. It was not only hatred and fear, but policy. Quote, "If France wishes to regain San Domingo, she must send hither 25,000 men in a body, declare the Negro slaves, and destroy at least 30,000 Negroes and Negresses, the latter being more cruel than the men. These measures are frightful, but necessary. We must take them or renounce the colony. Whoever says otherwise lies in his throat and deceives France." End quote. This was the general opinion of the whites. Kill them all off and get new ones who know nothing about liberty and equality. They chained 16 of Toussaint's generals to a rock, where they wasted away 17 days. They drowned old Pierre Baptiste. The wife and children of Maurepas were drowned before his eyes, while sailors nailed a pair of epaulets to his naked shoulders. Epaulets are stripes that officers will wear on their shoulders. Some of the French, it is fair, turned in horror from this barbarism. A few captains of boats refused to drown the blacks handed to them, but sold them into slavery instead. Some others landed them on deserted beaches in San Domingo or other islands. Alex, commander of Port Republican, would not accept 10,000 shots sent to him to tie to the feet of those to be drowned. Rochambeau banished him. Mazard, another sea captain, worked as hard to save blacks as most of his colleagues to drown them, but these were drops in the ocean. It was the policy of the Tories that the British followed in Ireland in 1921, not the remonstrances of the Manchester Guardian. The Manchester Guardian argued against killing the Irish, whereas the British policy was to kill lots and lots of Irish people. So not the remonstrances of the Manchester Guardian or the Society of Friends. It was the policy of the Tories that the British followed in Ireland in 1921, not the remonstrances of the Manchester Guardian or the Society of Friends. Okay. I'm reading a long reading tonight. Dessalines was a one-sided genius, but he was the man for this crisis, not Toussaint. He gave blow for blow. When Rochambeau put to death 500 in Le Cap and buried them in a large hole dug while they waited for execution, Dessalines raised gibbets of branches and hanged 500 for Rochambeau and the whites in Le Cap to see. But neither Dessalines' army nor his ferocity won the victory. It was the people. They burned San Domingo flat so that at the end of the war it was a charred desert. Why do you burn everything? Asked a French officer of a prisoner. We have a right to burn what we cultivate because a man has a right to dispose of his own labor, was the reply of this unknown anarchist. An anarchist is someone who rejects government. And far from, and there's a lot more to that than that basic short line, and far from being intimidated, the civil population met the terror with such courage and firmness as frightened the terrorists. 3 blacks were condemned to be burnt alive. A huge crowd stood round while 2 of them were consumed, uttering horrible cries. But the third, a boy of 19, bound so that he could not see the other 2, called to them in Creole. You do not, quote, you do not know how to die. See how to die. By a great effort, he twisted his body in his bonds, sat down, and placed his feet in the flames. Let them burn without uttering a groan. Quote, I was there, end quote, said Lemonnier de la Fosse, quote, spectator of the heroic death of this wretch, greater than Musui Scaiovola. These were the men we had to fight against, end quote. Another, thrown to the dogs, showed no anger, but stroked them and encouraged them while he presented his limbs to be destroyed. With the women, it was the same. When Chevalier, a black chief, hesitated at the side of the scaffold, his wife shamed him. Quote, you do not know how sweet it is to die for liberty, end quote. And refusing herself to be hanged by the executioner, she took the rope and hanged herself. To her daughters going to execution with her, another woman gave courage. Quote, be glad you will not be the mothers of slaves, end quote. The French, powerless before this fortitude, saw in it not the strength of the revolution, but some peculiarity special to blacks. The muscle of a Negro, they said, contracted with so much force as to make him insensible to pain. That means not be able to feel it. They enslaved the Negro, they said, because he was not a man, and when he behaved like a man, they called him a monster. In the spring of 1803, Bonaparte was preparing vast armaments to send to San Domingo during the coming autumn. With sublime impudence, he blamed the blacks for what was happening in San Domingo. At a meeting of the institute at which Gregoire was present, he said that the friends of the blacks should hide their heads at the news from San Domingo. That the blacks would not docilely submit to be slaves again was an unpardonable crime, and they wreaked their vengeance on the man whom they considered mainly responsible for their disappointment. It was Toussaint's resistance which had upset all calculations. And I'm going to stop right here for tonight. I love you, Devin. Sleep tight and don't let the chappies bite. How are the chappies going to bite? You're in Texas. I love you. Mwah, mwah, mwah. Sleep well. Good night.